One would think that in an industry worth $200 billion, an industry that produces thousands of games every single year, finding a good open-world fantasy action RPG would be trivially easy. And yet somehow, it's just as rare and just as depressing as finding a good Star Wars movie since Disney got involved, right? I mean, just look at the numbers, okay? Over the past 10 years, the release of open-world fantasy action RPGs averages out to maybe 2 major titles per year. 2! If we loosen the criteria a little and throw in games that are some variation of open world or games that call themselves RPGs while offering roughly the same character depth as Steven Seagal's acting range,
You got nothing.
we can squeeze that number up to 3, occasionally, on a good year. And as you can see from these charts, even those modest numbers aren't evenly spread. Some years gave us genuine riches, while others gave us broken promises, day one patches, and the audacity to call it content. Which is exactly why when a game comes along that does it right, sprawling world, deep mechanics, and the kind of fantasy atmosphere that makes you forget you have a job, it becomes a cultural event. The kind that sends forums into a frenzy and IGN into a confused, slack-jawed stupor, scrambling to explain how a game with no political agenda, no mandatory diversity checkboxes, and no lecture about carbon footprints somehow turned out to be good. And then there are the fans, left with that specific bittersweet grief you only get after finishing something truly extraordinary. That hollow, aching moment where you close the game and just sit there, knowing you will never get to experience it for the first time again, and that something this good won't come around for years. And then you spend next 5 days meticulously downloading a fresh list of 6,000 mods. Escape Helgen again. Then admire that new Riverwood texture pack. Maybe attend a sermon in front of the Talos Shrine.
Do the elves take your homes? Your businesses? Your children? Your very lives?
And inevitably arrive at that devastating realization. Why the hell aren't more games like this? And no game on this list is more anticipated, more dissected, or more cruelly teased than our first entry. Its entire official announcement is shorter than a YouTube ad, and it's slowly approaching its 10-year anniversary. Todd Howard's response to years of fan anticipation was straightforward, as always.
You know, we'll talk about the Elder Scrolls 6 reveal.
Just pretend we didn't announce it.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist.
The Elder Scrolls 6, a successor to Skyrim, a game from 2011 that is somehow still alive, still beautiful, and still expanding, not because of Bethesda, but in spite of them. The modding community has spent nearly 15 years patching, rebuilding, and reimagining it into something its creators never could have managed alone. But Bethesda has been asleep at the wheel for a while now, and nowhere was that more painfully obvious than Starfield.
The space game.
A game that wasn't terrible exactly, but wasn't what anyone actually needed. The result was a game that felt simultaneously enormous and empty. And while Starfield wasn't the catastrophic failure some made it out to be, it did something arguably worse. It delayed a sequel to a beloved franchise indefinitely, which is precisely why The Elder Scrolls 6 carries an immense weight for Bethesda. It's a make-or-break moment disguised as a game release, a chance to prove that the studio that defined open-world fantasy RPGs still knows how to make one. The modding community kept the flame burning for almost 15 years, and now it's Bethesda's turn to actually deserve it. Feel free to accuse me of being dramatic. It's just, I've had all that time to work up to it. By now, I think we all know that these people are not the same ones that were involved in the creation of Morrowind, Oblivion, or Skyrim. Heck, the studio changed more than Daenerys did in the final season of Game of Thrones. But despite justified skepticism, I want to remain hopeful. Remember what we said at the beginning about how rare these games truly are? Well, the clock is ticking, and the genre isn't exactly overflowing with alternatives while we wait. It is time for Bethesda to pull their heads out of their asses and once more give fans what they deserve. So what does that actually mean? What do the fans actually need from this game? Because in a genre this rare, every single entry needs to count. Well, first and most obviously, the gameplay. The Skyrim formula was already showing its age by the time you put the controller down, and that was in 2011. Whenever The Elder Scrolls 6 finally arrives, expecting the same bones with a fresh coat of paint will be, frankly, insulting, right? I mean, nobody is asking Bethesda to reinvent the wheel, but we are asking them to at least build a better one.
I'm serious.
And before anyone brings up the story or writing, I think we can all agree that nobody is expecting a narrative masterpiece from Bethesda either. They have never been great storytellers, and at this point, that's almost a brand identity.
I don't read a script. Script reads me.
What we do expect, however, is a living, breathing world, with systems deep enough to get lost in, mechanics that feel genuinely evolved, and world building that rewards curiosity rather than punishing it. At its core, what we need from the Elder Scrolls 6 is simple: a true open-world fantasy RPG that doesn't apologize for being exactly that. Give us something extraordinary to explore. It's that simple. Second, and this one matters enormously, post-release support. Test 6 will be built on Creation Engine 3, which means modding will almost certainly be part of the ecosystem. And that's great news. But the thing Bethesda needs to understand, and understand clearly, is that the modding community is a gift, not a crutch. For too long, Bethesda has shipped broken, half-finished experiences and shamelessly relied on unpaid modders to patch, fix, and essentially complete their games for them. That is not a development strategy, and it cannot be one this time. Just look at what Pearl Abyss did with Crimson Desert. Patch after patch, week after week, actively listening to player feedback, and visibly, tangibly improving the game in real time. And we as a community felt heard, respected, and genuinely invested in the game's success. If Bethesda could manage even like half of that, it would represent a sea change in how they operate. And more importantly, it might just be enough to rebuild the trust they've spent the better part of a decade eroding. Look, we need more good open-world fantasy games, guys, and this was just my take. You might be more optimistic or considerably less, and either way, I would love to hear it. Are you still holding out hope for the next Elder Scrolls, or did Starfield finish the job? Let me know in the comments below. But Bethesda isn't the only team with something to prove. There is another game on this list, one developed by people who laid the foundations for it. The Wayward Realms. Ted Peterson and Julian LaFay. If those names don't ring a bell, these are two of the lead developers behind the Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall, the original architects of the very genre we've been mourning the scarcity of this entire video. After leaving Bethesda, they founded Once Lost Games, with one singular ambition: to build the game that Daggerfall always wanted to be, powered by everything modern technology can offer. They call it a grand RPG, and the moment you hear what they are actually building, you will understand why nobody has attempted this before. The Wayward Realms is set across the archipelago, over 100 realistically scaled islands, where kingdoms rise, factions scheme, and dynasties set generational plots into motion. Around 500,000 square kilometers of procedurally generated open world. For context, Skyrim fits into roughly 37 square kilometers, and the world of Pywell from Crimson Desert is roughly 200 square kilometers. Now, and this needs to be said because we all just lived through Starfield, the word procedural is going to trigger some people, which is totally understandable.
You know what they say, fool me once, strike one, but fool me twice, strike three.
Developers' approach is built around something called wave function collapse, a system that generates the world with internal logical consistency rather than pure randomness, with terrain, settlements, and dungeons emerging based on surrounding context rather than a dice roll. Whether that truly solves the Procton problem or simply repackages it more cleverly, I honestly can't say, but I'm cautiously willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. To handle a world of this scale, Once Lost built their own proprietary engine called Realm Engine, specifically because Unreal Engine 5 couldn't support the kind of simulation they had in mind. The engine can track every single NPC across that 500,000 kilometer world in real time while using minimal processing power.
Magic?
Impressive on paper, although there is something important to be said about switching engines this late in development, but I will get to that in a moment. The RPG systems are deep and classically built. Custom character classes, skills, spell crafting, faction reputation, granular character building that modern RPGs have been systematically filing away for years.
I like the sound of that.
But the standout mechanic is what Once Lost calls the Virtual Game Master, or VGM, a background system that watches everything you do and responds dynamically.
How does it work?
Quest completions, faction interactions, reputation shifts. The VGM processes all of it and generates consequences. NPCs you wronged 3 hours ago may become antagonists in future quest lines, and information about your actions spreads through the world at realistic speed. You can even intercept it before it reaches someone if you act fast enough. The VGM now stores context as natural language and uses an embedded LLM to translate that back into game events, not writing quests from scratch, but weaving threads within writer-authored templates and carefully constructed rules. It's a nuanced implementation, and the fact that it will be fully moddable and open source is the kind of decision that's worth noticing.
What's the bad news?
Sadly, this ambition has been shadowed by setbacks, a few unavoidable and at least one that raises real questions. The game was funded through Kickstarter, which is already a high-wire act for an ambition of this scale. Then in late 2025, Once Lost abandoned Unreal Engine 5 entirely and built Realm Engine from scratch, pushing the planned 2025 early access window. Then came another delay of 2 to 3 months. Some of these setbacks are honestly hard to fault. The passing of Julian LaFay, co-founder, co-creator of Daggerfall, the man whose vision runs through every inch of this project, is the kind of loss that doesn't show up on any roadmap, and the team carrying his documented vision forward deserves real acknowledgement for that. But the engine situation is harder to excuse. Switching engines this late into development is more than just a setback. It's a fundamental miscalculation. The choice of engine shapes everything: tools, workflows, the skills you hire for. Realizing years in that your engine can't support your ambitions suggests either the original choice was poorly researched or the project's scope grew beyond what was planned and nobody pulled the handbrake early enough. Either way, it's a decision that should have been caught much sooner. And yet, The Wayward Realms belongs on this list, not as a sympathy entry, not as a brave little studio story, but because of what successfully pulling this off would actually mean for the person holding the controller. A world that always remembers you, a scale that feels like it exists beyond the edges of your screen, a character that is yours in a way prepackaged protagonists never can be. True open-world fantasy RPGs are rare, not because developers lack imagination, but because the ambition required to build one properly has a tendency to eat studios alive. The early access build will be rough. The developers have been upfront about this, and the internet will not wait for context. People will judge it anyway. The Reddit threads will not include disclaimers. If the early access build has bugs, clunky animations, or placeholder art, and it will, because that is what freaking early access is, there will be a wave of hot takes written with the confidence of a final review. You know, that's just the world we live in, man. In a landscape where true open-world fantasy RPGs are about as certain as George R.R. Martin finishing The Winds of Winter,
Do something else.
The Wayward Realms is one of the very few projects attempting to fill that gap while redefining what the genre can be. What matters is that underneath all of it, Once Lost is building something technically remarkable and philosophically ambitious, rooted in a true love for the genre you can hear in every developer diary they've released. Whether it fully delivers is a question only time will answer, but the attempt alone is worth paying attention to. Everything we've talked about so far has been about scale. Worlds so vast they could swallow you whole. The next game asks a different question entirely. What if the world doesn't need to be enormous to feel inescapable? What if all it takes is something far more efficient? Immortal predators, a medieval world rotting from the inside,
Vampires?
and a protagonist who is rapidly becoming one of them. The Blood of Dawnwalker. Developed by Rebel Wolves, a studio founded by veterans of The Witcher 3 and published by Bandai Namco, The Blood of Dawnwalker is a single-player, open-world dark fantasy action RPG set in 14th century Europe. The Witcher DNA is all over it. The moral ambiguity, richly detailed world that reacts to your presence, multi-layered narratives, and that haunting feeling carried by familiar Slavic music. You play as Cohen, a young man turned into a Dawnwalker who is caught between the human world and the realm of night. The story unfolds across Vale Sangora, a valley now under the rule of Brensis, a centuries-old vampire lord, and his inner circle of vampiric masters. Cohen's family has been taken, and 30 days from now, Brensis plans to mark his coronation with their blood. Those 30 days are all Cohen has before Brensis' coronation changes everything, but the timer only moves when you choose to move it. Exploring the open world, fighting, talking, none of that moves the clock forward. Only deliberate, meaningful actions do, and you are always told the cost up front. When those 30 days expire, the game doesn't end. The circumstances permanently change. Brensis' coronation proceeds, and whatever Cohen did or didn't do determines what remains. Being a Dawnwalker means living two parallel lives, and the game takes that literally. Day and night cycles define what Cohen is capable of and how the world responds to him. During the day, Cohen moves through the world as a human. He relies on sword combat, witchcraft, hexes that cost his own health as a price for bending reality, and a reputation with the vampire regime that determines how much of the valley is open to him. At night, vampiric abilities such as Shadow Step and Plane Shift reshape the entire experience. But most importantly, blood becomes a necessity. Feeding on innocence raises a corruption meter that unlocks more power while pulling Cohen further from his humanity. The combat evolved visibly between the first reveal and the Road to Launch event, with the developers openly incorporating community feedback, including reworking the ability selection system so it runs in real time without pausing combat. Beyond the action, choice and consequence drive everything. Every quest plays out differently depending on when you take it, what you've already done, and who you've made enemies of. Rebel Wolves frame this as a narrative sandbox, and the key design decision behind it is that there is no distinction between main quests and side quests. There are just different stories you choose to weave together because Bail Sangora remembers everything. Every officer in Brensis' network tracks your interference through an infamy system, and as infamy grows, Brensis issues valley-wide edicts that make the world progressively more hostile. Kill a blacksmith and the forge closes permanently. Free prisoners from a blood transport and word spreads. The consequences are systemic, and they accumulate. What gives all of this moral weight is that the vampires aren't written as simple monsters. As one of the writers put it in the Road to Launch stream,
if you look closely, you can say that their rule doesn't really differ much from what the mortal lords before them were doing, before the Valkyrie took over.
The question of whether a monster ruling through fear and blood taxation is meaningfully worse than a human doing the same with taxes and conscription exposes a boundary that, once you start looking, is blurred far more than we'd like to admit. A fantasy world where reputation could shape political climate, where dead NPCs stay dead and their absence ripples outward, where the same quest might tell a different story depending on your choices. This is what the genre could look like when the focus shifts from how big the world is to how much it remembers. Rebel Wolves are building consequence into the foundation, and if it lands the way it is designed, the result could be a world that feels actually alive at a fraction of the scale other games in this video are working with. And consequence, almost by definition, breeds curiosity. What happens if you side with the vampire regime instead of the rebellion? What if you let the clock run down on purpose, purely out of spite and morbid curiosity? What if that blacksmith you kept alive in your second playthrough turns out to be the key to something you missed entirely before? The Blood of Dawnwalker comes with an invitation to replay it with a completely different set of decisions and watch the valley respond differently every time. For a genre that has historically rewarded exploration of space, Rebel Wolves are making a case for exploring possibility instead. They're doing it with a confident vision, a release date, and a track record that speaks clearly enough on its own. September 3rd will tell us whether the execution matches the ambition. We spent the last few minutes talking about blood-soaked valleys and vampire lords. After all that dread, it's time to change the scenery and revisit some old feathery friends. If you're perfectly comfortable with morally flexible chicken kicking as a stress relief method, the like button is right there. And if you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, subscribe, because the franchise that turned overpromising into an art form is, well, it is finally coming back. I'm talking about Fable, of course. After years of silence and enough fan speculation to fill Albion twice over, Playground Games is handing us the keys to a world some of us never quite stopped missing. Now, if Fable is a completely new name to you, you are exactly where you need to be. This is a full franchise reboot from the ground up, and Playground Games have been unambiguous about that. If the original trilogy passed you by entirely, you're not behind. The studio behind it is best known for the Forza Horizon series, open-world driving games celebrated for their handcrafted environments, their sense of place, and their ability to make exploration feel deeply rewarding. Whether those instincts translate to a fantasy RPG is a fair question, and one the gaming community has been actively debating since the announcement. What Playground have shown so far makes clear they took the world-building side of that pedigree very seriously. Albion, rendered here in what the developers describe as fairy tale realism, is handcrafted, richly detailed, and visually arresting in a way that is difficult to overstate. Idyllic rolling hills, magical forests, bustling cities, sleepy hamlets, craggy coastlines, and spooky marshes are all built with the kind of deliberate care that probably accounts for a significant portion of why this game took as long as it did. And it is, for whatever else you might say about it, genuinely beautiful. This is also the first Fable game to offer a truly open world in the modern sense. Previous entries were structured as interconnected zones rather than a seamless, explorable landmass, and the first in the franchise's history to launch on PlayStation. Both of those facts expand the potential audience considerably, and both carry weight for a series that spent its entire existence as a Microsoft exclusive. The world is populated by over 1,000 unique NPCs, each operating on individual daily routines. They go to work, pursue hobbies, head home to sleep, and according to the developers, every single one of them can be spoken to in fully voiced conversations. What makes this more than a numbers boast is the reputation system underpinning it. Morality here is no longer a simple good versus evil slider. Your reputation is built from witnessed actions, what people actually see you do in front of them. For example, buy up every house in a village, and some residents may start referring to you as a rich twat. Which brings us to something the latest gameplay trailer made apparent. Fable's dialogue is not shy about modern slang.
I don't deal with randos. Feast going vegan this year.
Almost everything shown and revealed up to the making of this video looks promising, except these jarring lines that, in my opinion, don't belong in a fantasy setting. In the end, it might not be that big of a deal. Some folks wouldn't even notice it perhaps, but holy shit, does it pull you out of immersion when it happens.
That day was just brill.
What's going on?
According to the developers, choices and consequences run through everything. Hire an NPC to work for you, or a victim from their home. Romance a villager, get married, have children. Buy every house in Albion, every business if you want. Marry several more people, have even more children, and get divorced in the process, of course. Because apparently nobody, not even in a fantasy world, has figured out how to make polygamy work long-term.
That's easy.
These life simulation elements are a familiar Fable touch, and whether that blend proves meaningful or merely decorative is one of the more interesting open questions heading into launch. If those systems have genuine depth, the possibilities for getting thoroughly, happily lost in Albion are real. If they're surface-level distractions, well, they'll be forgotten within the first few hours. Character customization has been one of the most frequently asked questions since the first reveal, and the answer sits somewhere in the middle of what people were hoping for. You can choose your character's head, clothing, hair, skin tone, tattoos, and scars, but don't expect the granular sliders of a dedicated character creator. Fable has always leaned towards shaping your hero through deeds rather than menus, and this reboot follows a similar tradition. You begin as a child, discovering heroic ability, growing into Albion's first hero in a generation following a mysterious event involving a stranger, a grandmother, and the unsettling business of people being turned to stone. A couple of features stood out from what's been shown so far. Combat seemed noticeably fluid, light and heavy combos, seamless switching between melee, ranged, and magic without animation delays, and a responsiveness that drew more than a few Witcher comparisons. Returning enemies include hobs, balverines, hollow men, and trolls, alongside a couple of new additions. And you can also ride a horse, which marks the first time the ability has appeared in a mainline Fable title. So why does Fable belong on this list? Nothing in what Playground Games have shown announced a genre-defining mechanic, a standout system that reframes what an RPG can be, or a design philosophy that hasn't been attempted before in some capacity. What it announced was a convergence, a world of uncommon visual beauty, a reputation system with real texture, life simulation depth that could be compelling if it lands, and the particular brand of morally chaotic humor that made the original trilogy so distinctly its own. Individually, none of those things are revolutionary. Together, calibrated correctly, they could form the recipe for exactly the kind of open-world fantasy RPG that this genre so rarely delivers well. And in a genre this sparse, a world this carefully constructed, carrying systems with this much potential is argument enough. The game has been officially delayed to February 2027, a decision that, in hindsight, few will argue with. Launching in the same window as GTA 6 would have been a significant commercial risk for a game with a dedicated but smaller fanbase, and Microsoft ultimately made the pragmatic call. Whether February gives Fable the breathing room it needs to find its audience, or simply delays the conversation by a few months, remains to be seen. But at least now it gets to have that conversation on its own terms. And if you want to join that conversation, you'll have to show up on February 18th and spend $100 or wait 5 days for the game to permanently drop to $70 on February 23rd.
Why are you saying it like that?
For a fact.
Once every few years, an RPG arrives that permanently rewrites what the genre is capable of. The Witcher 3 did exactly that, and hoping The Witcher 4 can pull off the same trick twice? Some would call it straight up crazy.
Crazy's better than nothing.
Before diving in, it's worth briefly acknowledging that The Witcher 4 isn't the only project CDPR has in motion. A full remake of the original Witcher game is in development, and early reports suggest it will be built as an open-world experience, a meaningful departure from the original structure, and an interesting prospect in its own right. But a remake, however ambitious, is still a remake. The Witcher 4 is where the new chapter begins, and that's where the real conversation lives. But before The Witcher 4 arrives, CDPR are offering one more chapter with Geralt. Songs of the Past, the third major Witcher 3 expansion, is by CDPR's own description, in a way, a prologue for the series' future. You play as Geralt one final time in a story set explicitly before Ciri takes the path in The Witcher 4. How directly it feeds into the sequel's narrative remains to be seen. Either way, it's designed to be a bridge, not a farewell. The expansion is co-developed with Fool's Theory and targeting a 2027 release. Following the Wild Hunt's success, The Witcher 4 isn't competing with other studios' games so much as it's competing with its own legacy, which is a considerably harder fight in my opinion.
I am my own worst enemy.
Adding another layer to that pressure is the Cyberpunk 2077 launch, still one of the more spectacular stumbles in recent gaming history. CDPR shipped a broken product, watched the goodwill of years evaporate almost overnight, and spent the better part of 3 years rebuilding both the game and their reputation.
We never ever intended for anything like this to happen. I assure you that we'll do our best to regain your trust.
Cyberpunk eventually recovered, and recovered impressively, but the gaming community tends to forgive without quite forgetting, and the memory of that launch will be sitting in the back of a lot of players' minds the moment The Witcher 4 goes live. The Witcher 4 will be scrutinized at launch in a way that few games are, and CDPR know it. How they handle that moment will define the studio's next decade as much as the game itself will.
I'll get it right this time.
CDPR made the decision to leave their proprietary Red Engine behind and build The Witcher 4 on Unreal Engine 5, a significant architectural shift that carries both opportunity and risk. The opportunity was demonstrated clearly in the UE5 tech demo released last year, which showcased dynamic weather systems, dense and detailed environmental rendering, real-time global illumination, and a level of foliage and atmospheric depth that the Red Engine would have struggled to match. It was visually a striking piece of work. The important caveat, and CDPR were explicit about this, is that the tech demo was not gameplay. It was a demonstration of the underlying technology and the visual possibilities the engine makes available, not a representation of what players will encounter in the finished game. This distinction matters, and it's worth keeping in mind as marketing ramps up in the years ahead. Placing Ciri at the center of The Witcher 4 as the playable protagonist is the single boldest creative decision CDPR have made with this project, and the response to it has been anything but uniform. The pushback from a portion of the fanbase was loud, and depending on your reading of the lore, not entirely without foundation. Ciri's story in The Witcher 3 had a trajectory, and some players felt that trajectory had a natural conclusion that didn't obviously invite a new chapter. Others pointed to her characterization and argued that the weight of her arc made her a difficult protagonist to build fresh player agency around. Those are fair creative concerns, and they deserve to be treated as such rather than dismissed. Personally, like I said in one of my previous videos, I'm cautiously looking forward to Ciri leading this chapter for a couple of reasons. For one, she is one of the most powerful beings in the entire Witcher universe. A woman who can move between worlds, who was hunted by an empire, who trained as a Witcher herself, so naturally the curiosity about what happened to her after is there. And secondly, just as I don't think Ellie's arc is truly resolved in The Last of Us Part 2, with more story clearly left to tell in what I consider an almost certain Part 3, I have never felt that The Wild Hunt gave Ciri's story a truly satisfying conclusion in any of its endings, one that felt complete and adequate to the weight of what she went through. If The Witcher 4 marks the dawn of a new saga led by Ciri, for me that alone makes it worth the journey. The Witcher 4 earns its place in this video not simply by virtue of its pedigree, but because of the scale of what CDPR are attempting. Moving to Unreal Engine 5 while passing Geralt's legacy to Ciri as its new playable protagonist in a world they claim will be deeper and more reactive than anything in their catalog is not a cautious move.
Are you sure we're ready for this?
That ambition could translate into something that defines a generation, or it could collapse under its own weight. Either way, the stakes are real and the eyes of the genre are on it. What many of us are secretly hoping for is a game that once again shifts the benchmark for what a true open-world fantasy RPG can be, the way The Witcher 3 did, the way very few games before or since have managed to. Hopefully The Witcher 4 can avoid the pitfalls that have plagued too many recent video games. Shallow quest design, hollow choices with no real consequences, worlds that looked alive but felt static, and narratives so preoccupied with social and political messaging that the actual craft of storytelling and compelling gameplay, much like Marble's reputation, vanished with Thanos' snap. CDPR have set that standard before, and they know exactly what meeting it demands of them. But at the end of the day, The Witcher is nothing without the people who believed in it, and that means you. So do you think CD Projekt Red have what it takes to deliver once more? Is Ciri a protagonist you're willing to follow into a new chapter of the continent's history? Or does the skepticism linger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Some announcements arrive with trailers, some even with release dates, and some are carefully choreographed marketing campaigns. And then there are announcements like this one, just a couple of sentences on social media, no footage, no title, no date, nothing, that somehow managed to break an entire corner of the internet.
Okay, let's hear it.
In May 2026, Warhorse Studios posted what may be the most understated bombshell in recent gaming memory, an open-world Middle-earth RPG. And for me, that was enough to stop in place. Because if there is one world that deserves this treatment, one fictional universe whose every corner was built with such care and intention that no medium on Earth is more capable of capturing its glory than a video game, that world is Middle-earth. So, Warhorse Studios, the Czech developer behind the Kingdom Come Deliverance series, has officially confirmed not one but two projects, an open-world Middle-earth RPG and a new Kingdom Come adventure. The studio has described the Middle-earth RPG as being true to their colors, huge, story-driven, and immersive. Interestingly, the game is titled a Middle-earth RPG rather than a Lord of the Rings RPG, suggesting the story could be set outside the familiar Frodo and Gandalf era of Tolkien's legendarium entirely.
Wait. There were markings.
If true, this may open the gates to the vast, largely unexplored history of the First and Second Ages. Beyond that, Warhorse have said very little. We're excited to tell you more when the time is right.
Wow.
Which is annoyingly reasonable, and that is exactly the problem, because once that painful realization sinks in, you'll need to find a way to slowly come to terms with how many years of your life you are about to sacrifice waiting for a release date. Anyway, let's move on. Kingdom Come Deliverance was built on a philosophy of grounded realism and morally complex storytelling, one where heroic moments exist but are earned through struggle and consequence rather than written into your destiny. Henry's arc across both games had its remarkable hard-won chapters, but the road there was rarely clean or comfortable. If Warhorse carry that philosophy into Middle-earth, the result could be something the franchise has only rarely glimpsed, a Tolkien game that trades spectacle for texture, one that builds its world from the ground up rather than borrowing the iconography of the films.
So it will be deeply immersive. That is something you can absolutely trust us on. This is how we do our games. It will be a living world. There will be interesting characters, memorable places, and of course a strong narrative focus. I guess you could say these are PR words, but I hope when it comes from us, you understand the weight in this, because we really live by that, and I hope it will show in the future. So I think it's important again to remind everyone that we are only working on the games we want to work on in the way we want to work on them. So it's our stuff.
So the main question then is how ambitious Warhorse are willing to be. The Middle-earth label rather than Lord of the Rings has fueled speculation that the game could be set during the Second Age, the Age of Numenor and the forging of the Rings of Power, or perhaps even earlier in the First Age's sprawling wars of Beleriand. Either setting would grant Warhorse enormous creative freedom while remaining faithful to Tolkien's lore, but the reality is none of this is confirmed. Yet. There is a name that sits at the foundation of everything this video has been about. Before Geralt hunted monsters across the continent, before the hero of Oakvale kicked chickens through Bowerstone, before dragons circled Skyrim's peaks, there was a man sitting in an armchair in Oxford, building a world out of languages he invented for the pleasure of it, writing myths for a country that, in his view, had none. J.R.R. Tolkien laid the ground on which virtually every fantasy world that followed him was built. He is in the truest sense the father of the genre, casting a shadow so long that some of the greatest fantasy authors alive have spoken openly about how difficult it was to step out of it and find their own voice. That is the measure of what he built. And yet, for all the movies, all the games, and all adaptations that have carried his name, a worthy open-world action RPG set in Middle-earth has never truly existed. The setting has produced compelling action games. Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War are entertaining on their own terms, but they borrow Tolkien's imagery without ever quite capturing his soul. Strategy games and some extraordinarily well-crafted mods built for them have kept the flame alive for years, and they deserve their moment of recognition, but they are not what we're talking about here. The closest the medium has come to a faithful immersive experience is The Lord of the Rings Online, an MMO that deserves real credit for its lovingly detailed depiction of the world, but it is an MMO nonetheless, and one that is unmistakably showing its age. And for the builders among us, there is Artacraft, a Minecraft mod that stands as the most accurate recreation of Tolkien's world in any game to date, faithful to the books rather than the films, and genuinely breathtaking in scope. But it is not an action RPG, and it will speak only to a specific kind of devotee. The open-world action RPG, the form that lets you live inside a place rather than stand at its edges, has never truly been given its chance in Middle-earth. Tolkien built an imaginary universe of unprecedented scale, gradually immortalized by every soul who discovered it for the first time. It deserves a game worthy of that permanence, and Warhorse may be the first studio capable of delivering it. None of us want to dwell on what failure would mean here, years of waiting and hope with nothing at the end of it. But that possibility exists. It always exists. And yet, so does the dream. And right now, for the first time in a long time, this dream feels closer than ever. I've always been a sucker for a good fantasy world. Always will be. And the sheer scale of what is coming makes this one of the most exciting periods the RPG genre has seen in a long time. And you know what? I'm rooting for all of them, perhaps more than they deserve. Because when games like these fail, we all lose something. Tell me in the comments which one has you most excited, which one you think I got wrong, and which one I missed entirely. I'll see you when any of these actually have release dates. Or delay announcements. Probably both.